The Complete Travels of the Ringwraiths, Nazgûl, before the Lord of the Rings. There is a version of this story where the Nazgûl are simply monsters on horseback, instruments of dread, black cloaks and screaming horses deployed at dramatically convenient moments. That version is comfortable. It is also wrong. Here is what the legendarium actually says. When you follow it all the way to the bottom, the Nazgûl were operational for most of the Third Age. Not lurking, not waiting, moving, hunting, destroying. Over the course of roughly 3,000 years, the 9 Ringwraiths dismantled every institution, every kingdom, every alliance that stood between Sauron and total dominion over Middle-earth. And they did it so patiently, so methodically, so far beneath the threshold of the stories people tell themselves about that age, that by the time Frodo Baggins picks up the One Ring and walks out his front door, the world he is trying to save has already been taken apart piece by piece and left in ruins. The Nazgûl did not fail. That is the thing. They nearly succeeded so completely that the ring no longer needed to be found. This is not a speculation pulled from nowhere. This is the appendices, unfinished tales, the Silmarillion, and Tolkien's own letters, read in sequence, with the gaps taken seriously. And the gaps, it turns out, are where the real story lives. So here is the question this script is going to sit with, and it is going to get heavier every time we return to it. If the Nazgûl spent over 2,000 years dismantling every civilization that could have resisted Sauron, destroying Arnor, bleeding Gondor, concealing their master's return, hunting the ring with tactical precision across thousands of miles, then was the destruction of the One Ring actually a victory? Or was it the moment Sauron's work was simply complete enough that the ring had already served its purpose? We will come back to that. But first, we go to the beginning. And the beginning is not the Third Age at all. The Silmarillion, specifically the chapter titled Of the Rings of Power and the Third Age, establishes the origin of the Nazgûl with a precision that the movies never managed. Sauron, in the Second Age, forges the Rings of Power with the assistance of the elven smiths of Eregion. 19 rings in total, not counting the one. 7 go to the dwarves, 3 go to the elves, and 9 go to men. Now pay attention to this next part, because this is the detail that changes everything about how you understand what the Nazgûl actually are. The 9 men who received those rings were not random. The Silmarillion is explicit. They were great kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They were the most powerful human figures of the Second Age. These were men who had already achieved dominion, already commanded empires, already bent history to their will through their own strength and intelligence. Sauron did not corrupt the weak. He corrupted the great. Think about what that means. Every one of the 9 Ringwraiths was once a man who looked at the world and shaped it, who built things, who led armies and founded dynasties, who was, in the context of his time, exactly the kind of person who might have prevented what Sauron was planning. And Sauron turned them first. That is not an accident. That is a strategy. By the time the free peoples of the Second Age began to understand what Sauron was doing, the 9 most powerful mortal men in the world were already his. The corruption itself was not instantaneous. This is crucial. Each of the 9 faded over years, over decades, into wraithhood as the power of their rings and the dominion of the One Ring ground their mortal nature away. Tolkien's Letter 246 describes this process in terms that are genuinely harrowing. These men did not simply die. They became, in his words, mere spirit without substance, existing fully in the wraith world while still technically alive, perceiving the physical world only as shadow and dim light, while the spirit world and the will of Sauron became their entire reality. Each one of them lived through that transition. Each one of them experienced the moment when the solid world began to thin and flicker around them, and the dark architecture of Sauron's will became more real than sunlight. And there is no record of any of them choosing to resist it. That is not a condemnation. That is a horror. Tolkien understood, with precise moral intelligence, that the men who accepted those rings were not fools and were not simply wicked. They wanted power. They wanted to preserve their kingdoms, extend their reach, achieve something lasting. Those are human desires, recognizable desires. And those desires, fed by Sauron through the medium of a golden ring, became the mechanism of their complete destruction. The 9 kings of men who once shaped the Second Age became, in the slow, terrible work of centuries, 9 instruments of annihilation with no will left that was not Sauron's will. Picture this. The first of the 9 becomes fully a wraith. We do not know the exact sequence or the exact moment. Tolkien never gave us that scene. But imagine it. A man who once commanded a kingdom, who once held a sword with a hand that was solid and warm, who once looked at a map and saw lands he ruled, standing in a chamber somewhere in the darkness of Sauron's domain, while the last thread of his independent existence dissolves. He is not dead. He will not die. That is the real punishment. He will continue, and continue, and continue, serving a will that is not his own, for so long that the civilization he built will become legend, and legend will become silence, and silence will become forgotten stone. Sauron loses the One Ring at the end of the Second Age. The War of the Last Alliance, the defeat of Mordor, Isildur cutting the ring from Sauron's hand on the slopes of Orodruin. And with that loss, Sauron's direct power collapses. He survives as a diminished spirit. But the Nazgûl, bound to the One Ring, bound to Sauron himself through the machinery of those 9 lesser rings, do not simply disappear. And here is where it gets genuinely strange. Appendix B, The Tale of Years, records that the Nazgûl are abroad again in the year Third Age 1300. That is roughly 400 years after the War of the Last Alliance, after Sauron's first defeat. During those 4 centuries, the historical record of the Nazgûl is essentially silent. 400 years. Think about that silence. These 9 wraiths who cannot truly die, whose existence is bound to rings that still exist on their fingers, whose master survives as a diminished but undestroyed spirit somewhere in the east. What were they doing? Where were they? Tolkien never answers this directly. But the cosmological rules of his world give us the tools to reason it through, and the answer those rules produce is more unsettling than any explicit account could be. The fundamental mechanics of the Nazgûl, established across multiple sources, are these. They are extensions of Sauron's will. When his power waxes, theirs waxes. When his power is broken, they are reduced to shadows of shadows, barely capable of coherent action. Tolkien's Letter 210 makes this explicit, clarifying that the Nazgûl retain vestigial individual character, but that their will is entirely subordinated to Sauron's dominance. Without his direction, they are not free. They are simply purposeless. They cannot act with intent without him. So in those 4 centuries after the War of the Last Alliance, with Sauron a wandering spirit too diminished to take form, the Nazgûl were not resting. They were not hiding in Mordor plotting. They were something worse than that. They were waiting, without the capacity to do anything else. Now take the full weight of what that means. These were once men. Men who had wills and desires and plans. Now they exist in a kind of terrible stasis, not asleep, not dead, present in the wraith world, perceiving everything and able to do nothing of purpose, because the will that animates them is not yet strong enough to direct them. Sauron cannot lift his hand far enough to point. And then, slowly, he begins to recover. Third Age 1000. The Silmarillion notes that Sauron stirs again. A shadow begins to gather in Greenwood the Great, which will eventually become Mirkwood. Third Age 1050. The shadow deepens. The forest begins to darken. Third Age 1100. The Astari arrive in Middle-earth. 5 Maiar, sent by the Valar, including Gandalf and Saruman, specifically to counter the growing shadow. The Valar are paying attention. They know something is rebuilding. and by Third Age 1300, the Nazgûl are abroad again. Not coincidentally, this is the exact period when Sauron has recovered enough presence, enough organized will, to direct them. The reappearance of the Nazgûl is not a surprise emergence. It is a deployment. Sauron has rebuilt just enough of his power to lift his hand and point, and the first thing his hand points at is the north. The Witch King, the greatest of the nine, appears in Angmar. Here we need to stop and appreciate what Angmar actually was, because the movies give it essentially no attention, and the Angmar campaign is the single most consequential thing the Nazgûl ever did in terms of reshaping the history of Middle-earth. Appendix A of The Return of the King, in the section covering the northern kingdoms, documents this in full. After the dissolution of Arnor following the death of King Eärendor in Third Age 861, the northern kingdom had split into three smaller realms: Arthedain in the northwest, Rudar in the east, and Cardolan in the south. These three successor kingdoms were already weakening, already fragmenting, already at odds with each other over territorial disputes, and the question of which line of descent held legitimate claim to Arnor's heritage. The Witch King did not create that division. He found it. He found it, and he made it worse. Because that is what the Nazgûl do. They do not build armies first. They find the cracks in what already exists, and they press on them until the structure falls apart on its own. Rudar was first. Its population was by this point largely composed of men of Hillman descent, with only a small Dunedain nobility that held the towers of the Trollshaws region. The Witch King's influence corrupted that nobility, essentially turned Rudar's leadership into an instrument of Angmar, and positioned an eastern kingdom bearing the legitimate name of an Arnorian successor state as a weapon against the west. Arthedain, the most purely Dunedain of the three realms, now had an enemy to its east wearing a friendly face. This is not a cavalry charge. This is not even a war yet. This is what a wraith with a millennium's worth of Sauron's strategic intelligence does when given time and direction. It finds the lever, identifies the fulcrum, and applies pressure in exactly the right place. Cardolan, the southern kingdom, was the first to fall in open war, around the year Third Age 1409. The Witch King's armies swept down through Rudar, invaded Cardolan, broke the kingdom, slew its king in the battle at Weathertop, which is called Amonsul in the text, and captured the great Palantir stone that had been kept there. The tower of Amonsul, the watchtower on the hill, fell. Pay attention to that detail. The Palantir, the seeing stone. In Third Age 1409, the Witch King didn't just destroy a military position. He removed one of Gondor's and Arnor's most powerful tools for long-range communication and coordination. He was not just winning battles, he was dismantling infrastructure. By Third Age 1636, the Great Plague arrives in Eriador. Tolkien's appendices record that this plague sweeps through Cardolan and kills most of the remaining Dunedain population there. The plague did not originate with the Witch King directly, but what follows from it does. The Barrow Wights, evil spirits sent out of Angmar and Rudar, take up residence in the barrows of Cardolan's dead nobility, the rolling hills south of the Shire, which Tolkien's hobbits will one day cheerfully call the Barrow Downs, become haunted ground. Human settlement retreats. There is a trajectory here. The Witch King is not just destroying kingdoms, he is transforming the landscape itself into something hostile to the free peoples. Cardolan does not just fall, it becomes a haunted wasteland that no one will resettle for over 1,000 years. The Barrow Wights Frodo and his companions nearly die inside in the Fellowship of the Ring are a direct consequence of a campaign of destruction that began 600 years before Frodo was born. By Third Age 1974, the Witch King has finished the work. Arthedain, the last Arnorian successor kingdom, falls. Its last king, Arvedui, flees north and dies in the ice of Forokel when the ship sent to rescue him is crushed by the cold. The north is gone. Think about what that means in absolute terms. Arnor was founded by Elendil in the late Second Age as one of the two great Dunedain kingdoms in exile. It was, alongside Gondor, the legacy of Númenor. It was the tradition, the lineage, the institutional memory of the highest human civilization in Middle-earth. And over a period of roughly 600 years of grinding attrition, the Witch King, directing the power of Angmar, with Sauron's strategic intelligence behind it, ground it to dust. Not in a single decisive battle, in a long, patient, methodical campaign of weakening and dividing and destroying, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but rangers in the wild, carrying a broken sword, keeping a lineage alive through sheer stubborn memory. That is what Aragorn is, in the Third Age. That is the full weight behind that man standing at the prancing pony, looking like a weather-beaten vagabond. He is the last surviving ember of something the Nazgûl spent 600 years extinguishing. Third Age, 1975. The year after the fall of Arthedain, the Witch King is defeated at the Battle of Fornost by a combined force of Gondorians under Prince Arnor and remaining elves led by Glorfindel. This is the moment Tolkien chooses to insert one of the most prophetically loaded lines in the entire legendarium. Glorfindel, after the Witch King flees the battlefield, says, "Do not pursue him, he will not return to this land. Far off yet is his doom, and not by the hand of man will he fall." That line is usually remembered as the prophecy that Éowyn later fulfills at the Battle of the Pelennor. But notice what it actually establishes in this moment. In Third Age 1975, the Witch King leaves the north because he has finished his work there. There is nothing left for him to destroy. The prophecy is not a consolation to Glorfindel. It is an acknowledgement that driving the Witch King off the field is not a victory. It is a transition. He is done with the north. He is moving on to the next assignment. That assignment is Minas Ithil, 25 years after Fornost. Third Age 2000. Appendix B records it cleanly. The Nazgûl issue from Mordor and besiege Minas Ithil. 2 years later, in Third Age 2002, the city falls. But there is a detail in this transition that deserves its own moment of attention, because it connects two different threads of the Nazgûl's history in a way that transforms how you understand both of them. Minas Ithil was, in the Second Age, the city of Isildur. It was the eastern fortress of Gondor, built to watch over Mordor. Inside it stood another Palantir. The Witch King, fresh from destroying the north, takes the one city in Gondor that contains a seeing stone, and he holds it. Third Age 2002. The Palantir of Minas Ithil passes into the possession of Sauron's servants. That seeing stone eventually becomes the Palantir through which Sauron corrupts Saruman and manipulates Denethor. The Palantir Pippin looks into, the one Aragorn uses to challenge Sauron directly. That stone is the Ithil Stone, captured by the Nazgûl in Third Age 2002. 980 years before the War of the Ring, the Witch King secured one of Sauron's most significant strategic advantages, and most people reading The Lord of the Rings have no idea the two events are connected at all. This is what I mean when I say the Nazgûl's invisible history is the history of Sauron's patient successes. Every piece of infrastructure that serves him in the War of the Ring was put in place centuries earlier, and the Nazgûl were the instrument of that placement. Minas Ithil, renamed Minas Morgul after its fall, the tower of sorcery that gleams with a pale and terrible light in the darkness of Ithilien, becomes the Witch King's seat. He rules there from Third Age 2002 until Third Age 3018, when he rides out on the hunt for the ring, over 1,000 years in that tower, looking out over the valley toward Gondor. What was he doing for 1,000 years? The answer is not nothing. The answer is exactly what it was in Angmar: grinding pressure, patient work, the slow degradation of Gondor's southern defenses, the corruption of the corsairs of Umbar, the political destabilization of Gondor's internal lines, the harassment of Ithilien, until the province became essentially uninhabitable and Gondor had to abandon it. Appendix A records the progressive weakening of Gondor's position through this period, the fall of the sea power of Umbar, the increasingly desperate wars on multiple fronts, the plague and the famine, the long winter. None of these events have the Witch King's fingerprints directly on them in the text. But all of them serve Sauron's design, and the Witch King sitting in Minas Morgul for 1,000 years, with the Nazgûl at his disposal and the Seeing Stone in Sauron's hands, is the constant pressure behind Gondor's slow deterioration. Picture this. It is late in the Third Age, somewhere in the long centuries between the fall of Minas Ithil and the discovery of the Ring. The Witch King stands in the highest tower of Minas Morgul and looks west across the Ephel Duath toward Gondor. Not impatiently. Patience is not something he has to practice anymore. He is beyond impatience. He has been alive, if you can call it that, for over 4,000 years. He has watched kingdoms rise and fall like seasons. He has been present for the destruction of everything Arnor ever built. He knows, with the cold certainty of a mind shaped entirely by Sauron's will, that Gondor's fall is not a question of whether, but of when, and that every year the Seeing Stone of Ithil sits in Sauron's hands is a year Gondor's stewards are being slowly blinded to the real shape of the war they are losing. He is not bored. He does not experience time the way a living man does. But there is something in that figure, looking west, that carries the full weight of what these 9 beings have become. Instruments without impatience, executors without mercy, carrying out a design so large and so long that no single mortal lifetime is sufficient to perceive its full shape. Now let us talk about the gaps, the real gaps. The Witch King's activities between Third Age 2002 and Third Age 3017 are documented only in broad strokes. But the other 8 Nazgûl are almost entirely absent from the historical record during this same period, which is to say, during the entire middle third of the Third Age. They are presumed to be operational. Sauron's forces are clearly being coordinated and directed throughout this era. Mordor is being slowly rebuilt. The slave armies of the East, the Easterlings and Variags, are being organized and supplied. The Haradrim are being brought into alignment with Sauron's will. None of this happens on its own. Sauron cannot yet operate openly in the Third Age's middle period. He is still technically in hiding, still presenting himself in Dol Guldur under the guise of the Necromancer. The direct management of his eastern and southern allies requires agents capable of operating with intelligence and authority, but without attracting the scrutiny of Gondor or the White Council. The Nazgûl are exactly those agents. Tolkien's letters confirm that the Nazgûl, while subordinated to Sauron's will, retain the memories and some of the character of what they once were. The 3 Nazgûl identified as having Eastern origins, including Hamul the Easterling, who is explicitly named in unfinished tales as second in power only to the Witch King, are likely the instruments of Sauron's long campaign to secure the allegiance of the Easterling and Haradrim confederacies. Khamul, who was once a great lord of Rhûn or thereabouts, retains some shadow of his original connections to the East. He does not ride there as a stranger. He rides there as something these peoples have been taught, over generations, to fear and revere in equal measure. And this is where the speculation cuts deepest and stays most firmly within Tolkien's cosmological rules. The Nazgûl's travels during the dark middle centuries of the Third Age were probably not primarily military. They were probably diplomatic, in the most terrible sense of the word. Visits to kings who needed convincing. Appearances in the throne rooms of men who had heard rumor of the Eye and did not yet know whether to believe in it. The Nazgûl are proof. They are the walking evidence that Sauron's power is real, that his rewards are real, and that his punishments are also real. No ambassador makes the case more effectively. Now here is what nobody asks about this period. Gandalf first enters Dol Guldur and discovers that the Necromancer is in fact Sauron, not some lesser shadow, in Third Age 2063. He retreats, as Sauron, warned of the scrutiny, abandons Dol Guldur temporarily. The White Council believes, for a period, that the threat may have passed. Then, in Third Age 2460, Sauron returns to Dol Guldur with greatly increased power. In Third Age 2850, Gandalf enters Dol Guldur again, secretly this time, and confirms not only Sauron's presence but finds the dying Thrain there, the father of Thorin, who was one of the 7 dwarf lords, possessor of one of the 7 dwarven rings, and who gives Gandalf the map and key that eventually set the plot of The Hobbit in motion. Hold that thought for a moment. Thrain had been captured and imprisoned in Dol Guldur. His ring was taken from him, and Gandalf found him there in Third Age 2850, which means Thrain had been in Dol Guldur for almost 100 years, because he disappeared from history around Third Age 2745. Who captured Thrain? Tolkien's Unfinished Tales answers this obliquely. Thrain set out to reclaim Erebor and was waylaid and taken. The Nazgûl are the most obvious mechanism for this kind of targeted capture, particularly given that one of the primary objectives of Sauron's long strategy was the recovery of the 7 dwarven rings, and Thrain possessed the last one. Khamûl, operating in the east, would have had both the authority and the intelligence capacity to identify and intercept a dwarven lord attempting to move through territory that was increasingly under Sauron's shadow. This is speculation, but it is speculation that follows directly from the mechanics Tolkien established, and it places the Nazgûl squarely in the middle of an event most people think of as entirely disconnected from their story. If the Nazgûl captured Thrain and delivered him to Dol Guldur, then the chain of consequence runs directly from that action to Gandalf receiving the map and key, to the dwarves recruiting Bilbo, to Bilbo finding the One Ring in Gollum's cave. Which means the Nazgûl's patient work in the east may have inadvertently set in motion the very sequence of events that leads to the ring's destruction. That is the kind of irony Tolkien constructed deliberately. Let us now come to the period the lore actually documents in detail. Third Age 3017, the Nazgûl Ride. Appendix B marks it. The 9 are abroad again. The specific word choice is significant. Again implies a prior period of lesser activity. Sauron's search for the ring is now open and declared. His servants move in the physical world with full intent and full power. But the full picture of what happens between Third Age 3017 and Third Age 3018, in the year before the War of the Ring begins, is not in the appendices. It is in Unfinished Tales, in the chapter called The Hunt for the Ring, and it is one of the most underread pieces of Tolkien's writing in the entire legendarium. This is the part where the Nazgûl stop being background horror and become something more troubling, a precision instrument of intelligence gathering and strategic pressure operated by a mind that has been running the same calculation for 3,000 years and is now, finally, close enough to the answer to taste it. Sauron has one piece of information, the name Baggins, and the name of a place, the Shire. He got this information from Gollum. Gollum was captured in the year Third Age 3017, brought to Mordor, and questioned by Sauron himself. Tolkien's appendices are stark about what happened. Gollum was tortured. The information he had was extracted. He gave Sauron the name Baggins and the word Shire, though whether he understood those words or simply repeated sounds associated with his memories is ambiguous. Now picture this. The Nazgûl are assembled in Mordor, and Sauron gives them their assignment. Not a battle, not a siege, a search. Find the creature called Baggins. Find the Shire. Retrieve what was taken. He cannot send his full army north yet. Gondor still stands. Rohan still stands. The timing is not right for open war. But he can send the 9. What Sauron has is a name and a region. What he does not have is a map that places the Shire precisely in the geography of the Northwest, because the Northwest of Middle-earth has been, for centuries, a depopulated wilderness. The successor kingdoms of Arnor are gone. The men who once kept records of those roads and rivers are gone. The Nazgûl have not traveled in Eriador in any force since the fall of Arthedain, 1,000 years ago. So before they can hunt, they have to orient. Unfinished Tales reconstructs the deployment pattern with remarkable specificity. The Witch King does not lead the initial reconnaissance in full force. The 9 divide. Some are sent through Rohan, approaching from the south, making inquiries about hobbits in the Riverlands area and among men who might have had contact with the Shire. Others probe from the east. Khamûl, specifically, is noted in Unfinished Tales as the one who eventually makes contact with the Shire itself, approaching from the east through the Gladden Fields region because that is the area most connected to Gollum's history and most likely to yield geographical information about where hobbits live. The Nazgûl are not just riding toward a known destination. They are conducting an intelligence-gathering operation across hundreds of miles of territory, trying to triangulate a location from a name. And here is what that reveals about their nature, that the movies almost entirely obscure. The Nazgûl have individual operational roles. They are not interchangeable. The deployment pattern Tolkien describes in Unfinished Tales assigns specific Nazgûl to specific geographic zones based on their particular strengths, their histories, their residual connections to the regions they once knew as living men. Khamûl goes east because the east is his. The Witch King coordinates because he commands. The others fan out through Rohan and the Brownlands, and Eriador's fringes because their vestigial characters make them effective in specific contexts. This is an intelligence network. It has always been an intelligence network. It just usually operates beneath the horizon of the historical record. During their sweep through Rohan, the Nazgûl encounter Saruman's interference. Unfinished Tales is explicit that Saruman, already in communication with Sauron, through the Palantir, and already deep in his own ambitions regarding the ring, actively impedes the Nazgûl's search in Rohan, not out of loyalty to the Free Peoples, but out of his own desire to find the ring first. He misleads them. He delays them. This is an astonishing detail. The Nazgûl, operating in Rohan in Third Age 3018, are being actively deceived by the leader of the Istari, who is himself a servant of Sauron, who is also trying to betray Sauron in favor of his own scheme. The hunt for the ring in the year before the War of the Ring is not a clean exercise of overwhelming evil force. It is a tangle of competing betrayals and shifting loyalties, and the Nazgûl are operating in the middle of it with imperfect information, imperfect coordination, and an enemy in their flanks who wears a friendly face. And they still nearly succeed, because by June of Third Age 3018, the Nazgûl have reached the Shire. Pay attention to this part, because this is where the hunt for the ring, as reconstructed in Unfinished Tales, becomes something genuinely frightening. Khamûl the Easterling arrives at Bag End. He speaks to a hobbit who is not Frodo. In fact, Khamûl is extraordinarily close to catching Frodo at multiple points. Unfinished Tales notes that Khamûl's particular weakness, relative to the Witch King, is that his sense of the ring is notably dimmer. He can perceive it, but with less precision. If the Witch King had ridden to the Shire instead of Khamûl, the outcome of that scene might have been entirely different. The 9 miss Frodo in the Shire by days, perhaps hours. Khamûl asks about Baggins. He gets directions to Bag End. Frodo has already left. The timing of Gandalf's counsel, the timing of Frodo's departure, the accident of Khamûl's comparative weakness in sensing the ring over the Witch King's, all of these things combined to create a gap of days that the Nazgûl just barely failed to close. That is not a comfortable margin. The subsequent chase through the Shire and into Bree is documented in both the main text of the Fellowship of the Ring and in the Unfinished Tales reconstruction, and the two accounts are not entirely identical, which means Tolkien was still refining exactly how close the Nazgûl came. But the shape is consistent. The 9 know roughly where Frodo is. They are dividing their forces to cut off possible routes of escape. They have informants, or at least sources of information, among the men of Bree and possibly along the Greenway. They are not simply riding blind. When Frodo reaches Bree, the Nazgûl are already watching it. Unfinished Tales confirms that some of the 9 are positioned around Bree, while others continue surveillance further along the road toward Rivendell. The night the hobbits sleep at the Prancing Pony, the Nazgûl attack the inn, destroying the beds where they believe the hobbits sleep. Tolkien's account in Unfinished Tales clarifies that the Nazgûl at this point believe they have failed in a way they haven't quite understood yet. They are looking for the ring, and they cannot quite locate it because Frodo has not been putting it on, and a Nazgûl's perception of the ring is sharpest when the ring is active. Here is the implication of that. The Nazgûl's hunting methodology depends, in part, on their prey making mistakes. They are most effective when the ring-bearer uses the ring, because that act illuminates the bearer in the wraith world like a lit candle in a dark room. Frodo's terror and inexperience are actually, in this specific sense, an asset. He is terrified enough to keep the ring off his finger most of the time, which keeps him partly invisible to them. Aragorn knows this. Gandalf knows this. The entire strategy of moving Frodo from Bag End to Rivendell quickly, and without the ring being used, is implicitly a strategy of denying the Nazgûl the signal they need to fix his location precisely. And then Weathertop happens. Frodo puts the ring on. Amansul, the hill where the Witch King destroyed the Tower of Arthedain and took the Palantir in Third Age 1409, nearly 2,000 years earlier. Frodo puts the ring on at the exact same location where the Witch King first demonstrated his capacity for this kind of symbolic, crushing destruction. That is not a coincidence on Tolkien's part. It is not a coincidence in the world of the narrative either. The Nazgûl were drawn to Weathertop at least in part because the ruined Tower of Amansul is a place that echoes in the Wraith world, a place soaked in the history of their own victories. They know this ground. It is their ground. The Witch King himself leads the attack on Weathertop. 5 of the 9 come down the slopes of Amansul and surround the small fire, and the Witch King stabs Frodo with the Morgul blade. Now here is what that act actually meant, in the context we have built. The Morgul blade is described in the text as a weapon designed to make its victim into a wraith, specifically to draw the victim into the Wraith world, where the Witch King can command them. A shard of the blade is driven into Frodo's shoulder and begins working toward his heart. If it reaches his heart, Frodo becomes a wraith, a servant of Sauron, and the ring comes with him into the shadow. This is not a failure on the Nazgûl's part at Weathertop. This is a near-perfect execution of an alternative strategy. If they cannot simply take the ring by force, because the power of the ring itself protects the bearer from full domination by lesser forces, then drawing the ring-bearer into the Wraith world accomplishes the same objective from a different angle. Frodo does not have to be overpowered. He just has to die into wraithhood. The Nazgûl nearly accomplished this. They got the blade in. The shard was working. Gandalf, Aragorn and Elrond's knowledge of the Ringwraiths and their weapons combined to extract the shard just barely in time. Glorfindel's intervention and then the flooding of the Ford of Bruin, called by Elrond, drove the 9 back. But let us be honest about what the Ford of Bruin actually was. The Nazgûl were stopped at the ford, not by any weapon or military force that the Fellowship possessed. They were stopped by Elrond raising the waters of the Bruinen, a specifically elvish power exercised by one of the most ancient and powerful figures in Middle-earth. Gandalf contributed fire, which the Nazgûl fear, from the far bank. What the scene at the ford demonstrates is not the weakness of the Nazgûl. It demonstrates that stopping the Nazgûl required the direct intervention of a Maya-equivalent elf lord and a Maya in the form of Gandalf. Aragorn, Legolas, Boromir, 3 hobbits and a dwarf did not drive the Nazgûl back. Elrond and Gandalf did. That fact matters enormously for how we understand what happens to the 9 next. They do not remain defeated. They return to Mordor, regroup, receive new horses, and are deployed again before the Council of Elrond is even finished deliberating about what to do with the ring. By the time the Fellowship leaves Rivendell, the 9 are already in the field again. The War of the Ring period of the Nazgûl's activity is, in some ways, the most documented, but also the least analytically interesting, because by this point, the Nine are operating in open war, which means their movements are legible in ways that their centuries of shadow work never were. The Witch King commands the siege of Minas Tirith. He breaks the gate. He rides out on the Pelennor and fulfills the prophecy Glorfindel spoke 1,000 years earlier. Éowyn and Merry destroy him. But that ending, as devastating and triumphant as it is in the narrative, is not actually the conclusion of the Nazgûl's story in the Third Age. It is the conclusion of the Witch King's individual arc. The other 8 survive the Pelennor. They are only finally destroyed when the One Ring goes into the fire of Orodruin, because their existence is bound to the One Ring's existence, and when it is unmade, they are unmade with it. Picture this. The moment the ring falls, Frodo and Gollum on the edge of the crack of doom, the Nazgûl still circling above Mordor on their fell beasts, still operational, still carrying out the last commands of a master who is in that instant being unmade. They feel it happen. They feel the ring go, and in the Wraith world, which is the only world they can truly perceive, the great architecture of Sauron's will, the vast, dark structure that has been their sky for 3,000 years, simply ends. Not with a battle, not with a defiant last stand. The 9 men who were once kings of the Second Age dissolve into nothing between one heartbeat and the next, unmade by the destruction of the thing that made them. They do not even have time to fall. And now, finally, we come back to the question. The question is heavier now than it was at the beginning. You know more about what the Nazgûl actually did, about the specific weight of what they destroyed, and how long it took them, and how precisely they did it. So let it land with that full weight. Was the destruction of the One Ring a victory? Arnor is gone. It has been gone for over 1,000 years by the time the ring is destroyed. The Barrow Wights are still in the Barrow Downs. The Rangers are still scattered in the wild. Minas Ithil is still Minas Morgul, poisoned by 1,000 years of the Witch King's residence, so thoroughly corrupted that it must be destroyed entirely after the War of the Ring, its stones dismantled because it cannot be reclaimed. The Palantir of Ithil is gone, lost in the fires of Orodruin with Sauron himself. Eriador is still empty. The great roads of the north are still crumbled. The knowledge and culture and tradition of the northern Dunedain exists now only in Rivendell's archives and in the memory of one man who has spent decades living rough in the wilderness. The Nazgûl did not fail to destroy those things. They succeeded, completely, permanently. Gondor stands. Rohan stands. The Shire survives. Aragorn takes the throne. These are real victories, genuine and earned, paid for in blood and sacrifice, and the extraordinary grace of several convergent accidents. Bilbo finding the ring, Frodo inheriting it, Gandalf guessing its identity, Gollum surviving just long enough to bite the ring from Frodo's hand. But the world those victories preserve is already a diminished world. The flourishing civilization of the north is a memory. The great network of Dunedain kingdoms that once stretched from sea to mountain is rubble. The tree of the White City stands again, but the forest it came from was destroyed centuries ago. Tolkien knew this. It is the specific sadness built into the ending of The Return of the King. The Fourth Age begins as a restoration, not a renaissance. Things are rebuilt, but the height they once achieved is not recovered. The elves are leaving. The Maiar who served as Istari are withdrawing or broken. The dwarves are still diminished from the loss of their great halls, and the men who remain, even the noble Dunedain, are a smaller and shorter-lived people than their ancestors were, generation by generation growing more distant from the greatness of Númenor. The Nazgûl's work, in other words, was not undone by the destruction of the ring. It could not be undone. You cannot rebuild 600 years of Angmar's grinding pressure on Arnor in a generation. You cannot restore what the Witch King spent a millennium destroying. You can defeat evil. You cannot undo what evil has already done. This is the most adult and most devastating thing Tolkien built into his mythology. The victory at the cracks of doom is real. It is earned. It matters enormously that Sauron is destroyed, that the ring is gone, that the shadow does not cover the world. But the world it does not cover is already permanently smaller and more broken than it would have been if the Nazgûl had never ridden out of the shadows in Third Age 1300. The free peoples win the war, but they win it in a world the Nazgûl already reshaped. The 9 men who accepted those rings in the Second Age, who fell one by one into wraithhood, who then spent 3,000 years as Sauron's most precise and patient instruments of destruction, they did not fail in their mission. They completed it. The mission was to dismantle the structures of resistance. Arnor, dismantled. The political coherence of the northern Dúnedain, scattered. The Palantir network, compromised. The eastern and southern peoples, aligned to Sauron's banner. Gondor bled and weakened over centuries, until even its stewards were being manipulated through the very seeing stone the Nazgûl captured 1,000 years earlier. By the time Frodo walks to Mount Doom, those victories are fixed in history. They are geology now. They cannot be changed. And here is the thing that sits at the bottom of all of this, the thing that Tolkien built with the specific precision of someone who had himself watched what patient, destructive work could do to the world he loved. The Nazgûl are not the tragedy. The 9 men who became the Nazgûl, they are the tragedy. Every one of them was once a man who looked at the world and wanted to shape it for good, or for power, or for legacy, or for survival, and every one of them was offered something that seemed like a path to that desire, and every one of them took it. And in taking it they became, over centuries, the precise instruments by which everything they might once have wanted to build was destroyed. The man who became Khamûl was once great in Rhûn, or wherever he ruled. He built something. He had a kingdom, a people, a tradition. He took the ring Sauron offered because he wanted to preserve that, and what he spent the Third Age doing was making it impossible for anyone in the north or west to build and preserve the way he once had. The man who became the Witch King was once, by implication, the greatest of the 9 mortals who received rings, which means he was the greatest mortal of his age. Greater even than our Pharazôn, probably, in some combination of power and intelligence and force of will. A man like that, free of Sauron's corruption, might have shaped the Second Age entirely differently. He might have been the counterweight to Sauron's ambition that the Second Age needed and never had. Instead, he spent thousands of years being the mechanism by which every lesser man who tried to build something was broken. That is not just tragic. It is the specific tragedy Tolkien was always writing toward, the tragedy of gifts used in the service of their own negation. Power that could have created, spending eternity destroying. Will that could have chosen freedom, spending eternity as the most perfect instrument of another's domination. Now the question returns, and this time it carries all of that. Was the destruction of the One Ring a victory? Or was it simply the moment when it became possible to begin counting the cost of a loss that had been accumulating for 3,000 years, in the rubble of Arnor, and the haunted hills of Cardolan, and the corrupted stone of Minas Morgul, and the empty roads of Eriador, in every broken tower and abandoned barrow, and scattered people, that the 9 men who were kings left behind them on their long, patient journey, from the Second Age to the fires of Orodruin. The ring is gone, the Nazgûl are gone, Sauron is gone, and the world is still, indelibly, permanently, the shape they made it. I think about the Witch King at Fornost sometimes. The moment Glorfindel looks at the retreating figure and says, "Do not pursue him, far off yet is his doom." And I wonder whether the Witch King, in that moment, knew that Glorfindel was right. Whether some last vestige of the man he had been, trapped in the wraith world, perceiving events with the terrible clarity of a being who can see the shape of will and fate rather than just the surface of things, whether that vestige understood that the prophecy was also a kind of acknowledgement. You have done what you came to do here. The North is broken. You do not need to die in this field. You have work to do in the south. He did not die at Fornost. He died on the Pelennor, 1,000 years later, unmade by a woman who was not quite a man, and a hobbit who was not quite nothing, wielding a barrow blade forged in Arnor's last age, the very civilization he had destroyed. And even that ending is a Tolkien irony. The weapon that unmade the Witch King was made in the kingdom he dismantled. The people who found it were hobbits sheltering in the Shire, the small green corner of what used to be Arnor that survived because it was too obscure and too cheerful and too unpretentious to be worth destroying. The Shire survived the Nazgûl because the Nazgûl did not notice it, and the Shire produced the Ringbearer, and the barrow blade from broken Arnor unmade the Witch King on the Pelennor. Tolkien's world does not work in straight lines. It works in echoes. Every wound eventually answers. But the kingdoms are still gone. If any of this has shifted how you see the Nazgûl, if they look different to you now than they did before this, not as monsters on horseback, but as the long, slow mechanism of a 3,000-year project of civilizational destruction that was mostly complete before the story of the ring even began, I would genuinely like to know what you make of that. What does it change about how you read the War of the Ring? What does it change about what Aragorn's restoration of the kingdom actually means, when the kingdom being restored is the ruin of something that was itself already a ruin? The comment section is where that conversation happens, and it is a conversation worth having, because what Tolkien built, underneath the quest and the fellowship and the eucatastrophe of the ending, is a history of patient loss. A record of what falls when no one is watching and no one writes it down. And I think that history deserves to be read all the way to the bottom. There is more of this world to explore, every part of it this deep. Subscribe, and we will keep going down.